Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. Extra amazing because Krystal's back. It's good to see you.
Indeed. Yeah. It's much better to be back in the studio. And I'm feeling fantastic, wonderful, all of those good things. But I do reserve the right to blame COVID brain fog for any stupid things that I
like
say.
that.
For here and on out.
From here on out.
All right, lots to get to this morning. Some pretty stunning reports, leaks, quotes coming from anonymous sources and named sources about just what a catastrophe the Biden administration is. This is from Democratic insiders who were saying, you know, not only is he failing on a policy front, but on just like basic managerial competence, which is pretty devastating blow. So we'll give you all of those details, and there are many. We also have new revelations about just how this psycho was able to get his guns, the past interactions that he'd had with law enforcement that certainly should have kept him from being able to obtain the weapons that he did, and yet here we are. So we'll tell you about that. Also some new drama with the airlines that you have to see to believe. I mean, they're basically just caught lying about what's going on and getting called out for it. A stunning story coming out of North Carolina, someone we've talked to before, Matthew Ho, who is running as a Green Party candidate for Senate there. And the dirtiest tricks you can imagine being pulled by Democrats to keep him off the ballot, impersonating Green Party volunteers to try to bully voters into removing their names from petitions, blocking him in a partisan way, in a way that should be, frankly, illegal. So I'll break that down for you as well. And this one is pretty interesting. So Joe Rogan once again said something that he had told us before.
As he said many times, not just us.
Right.
Like
so the mainstream media noticed that he had been approached before by Donald Trump for an interview and had said no. And this is something he's talked about before. Well, Steve Bannon is apparently upset with Joe over him, you know, deciding not to do an interview with Donald Trump. So break that down for you. Also, the oil markets right now, totally wild. Oil prices collapsing. Yes. Obviously, you are seeing it a little bit at the gas pump, but not too much. So what exactly is going on there? But we wanted to start with big breaking news as of early this morning.
Happened just this morning. We were looking over it last night, didn't know what exactly the status was going to be. But Boris Johnson has officially resigned the office of Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. He was speaking to the British people this morning. Let's take a listen.
And to you, the British public, I know that there will be many people who are relieved and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
Them's the breaks, Krystal. I'll tell you what, I always loved Boris. You know, policy aside, he was a character. He really was a one-of-a-kind British figure. We're not going to see anybody like him in British politics again. Now, in terms of what this means, Boris has been in office for about 3 years after winning that pretty stunning election, which, you know, presaged what I thought could have been something interesting, but COVID really took him off the rails. All of these scandals kind of broke to the fore in the last 48 hours, where there were some decisions to snap ones by his cabinet members, and that led to a mass resignation in the last 48 hours by many of his most high-ranking ministers. All of them basically said they no longer had confidence in his ability to take the government. The biggest problem for Boris was he's just had scandal after scandal after scandal, which seemed very quaint here in the United States. Though I think the biggest one was that he was drinking and having parties during COVID in like May of 2020. By the way, after he was in the hospital, which is unconscionable, but he was having parties, high government officials. He was actually fined by the UK police after the investigation found that he did in fact break lockdown rules. That kind of was just the beginning. Then he recently appointed somebody who'd been like accused of sexual assault or some sort of lewd, untoward behavior. But just in general, his standing within the Conservative Party has been in question now for some time. And the mass resignation, it does seem kind of planned. You know, 2 people came and then the rest of them went out. And so from now, what's going to happen is currently the British government is on something called summer vacation. And in the annual party conference in the fall, there's a committee of the Conservative Party which is going to vote and elect their new leader. And whoever that will become the Prime Minister of the UK, because they do have, I believe they have 2 more years until there's another general election to be called there. But effectively, you know, he's resigned the office today. They'll vote whoever whoever his leader will be. I assume it will be in the next coming weeks or months, and then that person will succeed Boris Johnson as the next leader in the interim.
And he sort of wants to hang on until the fall, until they figure out his replacement, but there are a lot of calls for him to be gone basically immediately. I think one of his former aides said that there would be, quote, carnage if he wasn't out of there right away. And, you know, just candidly, I don't follow this nearly as closely as some people do, but from reading into it, I mean, it seems like this is one of those instances where the cover-ups were worse than the crime. So it's not just that he had these COVID lockdown parties, which I did follow that scandal pretty closely because it had a lot of echoes with different politicians here in the U.S. who were totally hypocrites, who were, you know, pro-lockdown. Of course, the UK was on pretty stringent lockdown at the time. And not only is he having these weekly parties, but then out and out lying about it multiple times. One of his aides was caught, they were caught sort of like making fun of the whole situation. And so that was one piece. And then with this latest scandal, which was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, I suppose, not to minimize, you know, the seriousness of the allegations here, but it wasn't just that this individual was accused of sexual harassment. It was also that there appeared to have been previous allegations that had been covered up by Boris Johnson. You layer on top of that, there were a number of other scandals within the Conservative Party of other sexual harassment, other sexual assault, some of them horrifying, some of them just like bizarre, like some dude who was watching porn on his phone in the House of Commons, like what? So all of this added up to a picture of someone who was not trustworthy, who was caught repeatedly lying to the public, covering up. And so, you know, Boris Johnson, he initially had this very sort of like buffoonish persona, which I think has sort of stayed with him. And this portrait of a very undisciplined, untrustworthy character is what ultimately seems to have done him in. They had 52 of resignations this week alone. One dude who he had just appointed on like Tuesday, by Thursday was submitting his resignation. So it became too much of a snowball effect for him to be able to withstand, even though as recently as yesterday, he was saying, I'm not going anywhere.
It's, you know, in their system, it's very difficult. Whenever you know you might either lose a vote of no confidence or when you have no support amongst your party because you wouldn't be able to appoint anybody to your cabinet. So the cabinet there has a very interesting history in the way that it works in terms of governance, and the ability to balance your cabinet is not really the same as it works with ours. It kind of used to work that way in our system back in the 1800s before Abraham Lincoln was president. So anyway, it's an interesting system that they have. So that means that we will have a new PM. The Conservative Party gets to decide who that person will be, and then that person will most likely stand for a general election against the Labor leader. I believe their name is Carrie Sturm. I can never say it correctly. Anyway, sorry, Brits. Anyway, we're tracking very closely. For our purposes and for the world, I actually do think this is a tremendously important development. And here's the reason. Boris was probably the single most hawkish leader on the in Europe on Ukraine. So he, of course, you know, we covered the two stories here. Number one, whenever his meeting with Zelensky and others, he said, we're not interested in a peace agreement here at all. This was months ago, kind of in the middle of the fighting. And most recently, he took Emmanuel Macron over and said, hey, you need to stop this diplomacy and all this other stuff. So the Anglosphere, if they do have somebody who is not as hawkish as Boris Johnson, and Boris, really, he was much more of a student of Churchill, and he saw himself within that vein, and he very much was much more hawkish towards Russia than any other leader within, not in the EU, but, you know, of his EU compatriots, I guess, who he was also meeting. And alongside Biden, they were pushing the most stringent policy against Russia. So whoever they appoint, it's going to be very, very important to see how they approach the Ukraine conflict. Are they going to have the same policy towards that? And actually, you know, could push things in a different direction. So for our purposes, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. Also, remember, we do a tremendous amount of trade with the UK. We have a bilateral trade agreement that's coming up, I believe, before Congress and others is being negotiated. So there's other interesting intersection areas as well. Yeah,
that occurred to me as well, because the US and the UK have really been a united front in taking a uniformly hawkish approach to Russia's war in Ukraine. You know, making it clear that they want the war to continue rather than trying to negotiate any sort of peace. As you said, Boris Johnson being very aggressive in conveying that to the French leader and very publicly telling everybody that he conveyed that to the French leader, even as the French said, well, that's not quite how it went. So the posture of whoever comes next is going to be incredibly significant to us and to what happens with that war going forward. Do I expect there's going to be a tremendous shift? No, not really, because ultimately I think, U.S. is driving this train, whether they should be or not. The U.S. is overwhelmingly sending the most amount of aid and weapons. And even as Biden loves to use this rhetoric of like, oh, we're just doing what the Ukrainians want. The truth of the matter is that the U.S. is driving the policy here, and UK is very likely to continue to back this up.
I completely agree. So look, it'll be interesting. We'll see what happens, and we'll keep everybody updated. Who knows what's going to...
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.